Okay, hello and welcome to the Farm Support After Brexit, How Sustainable Can It Be webinar brought to you by the Institution of Environmental Sciences. This webinar is part of a lunchtime series hosted by the IES, and we provide our members with regular CPD opportunities. They're always free and generally only available for IES members. If you are keen to attend future webinars, then please visit our website, which is www.the-ies.org, and explore the range of benefits you can receive by becoming an IES member. Today's webinar will be presented by Vicki Hird, Sustainable Farm Campaign Coordinator at Sustain. Vicki's had a very successful career working for various environmental organisations, such as Friends of the Earth, War on Want and Safe Alliance, before returning to Sustain. In addition, she is an award-winning author, strategist, and runs an independent food and environment consultancy, providing advice and strategic direction in all areas of food, farming and the environment. Today, Vicki will be discussing farm support post-Brexit, exploring some of the areas of opportunity as well as some of the challenges the UK farming industry faces as we leave the EU. So thank you for your attention, and please stand by because this webinar will be starting shortly.
Good morning. I hope you're all either enjoying a good lunch or had one. Thank you very much to the IES for inviting me to do this. It's an area very close to my heart, having worked on it for many, many years, although I have had gaps. So I will be talking about farm support after Brexit. How sustainable can it be? And hopefully by the end we will have some, we will be wiser on that. And I will try and not use the cursor because it makes a strange pencil mark. Anyway, going on to the first slide, just a little background about Sustain. We're an alliance. We're about 100 organisations now. You can see some of the names of the organisations there in our annual report and some of the things that we've worked on and achieved over the years. It's nearly 20 years in existence. Before that, it was called the Safe Alliance. And we work in all sorts of ways with all sorts of people to deliver change in farming policy and practice so that it's better for people and animals and the environment and people overseas as well, with strong ethic and solidarity with the global south. So if anybody's got any questions on that, I'm very happy to answer those. We've got a huge range of projects that we work on. I work on farming, but also on supply chain issues and on worker issues. Workers in the food system. But today we're talking specifically about farming and farm policy. Sustain has run campaigns over the years, particularly on common agricultural policy reform, the European policy which directs farming practices, supports farming and trade issues in Europe. But we have done work on agricultural policy in relation to farm workers, in relation to antibiotic use. We've run a antibiotics alliance with 3 other organisations. There's one of its reports there, and we're very keen to see a reduction in use of critically important, medically important antibiotics in livestock farming. Absolutely crucial part of sustainability, as I'm sure a lot of you recognise. The most recent report is on the left, top left-hand corner there, that we produced. I produced a report on sugar trade in Europe. I noticed I put that on there many, many years ago. It'll be out of date. But the top left-hand corner, beyond 2020 new farm policy, I'll be referring to later on. And some of these issues will come up later. So I wanted to start by just talking about the good, the bad and the ugly of where we're at with farm policy and Brexit, because obviously we do have we are at a point in time which I've not been in 30 years. I've not been at such a crucial, groundbreaking point in time on farm policy for the UK. The agricultural policy that has directed our farming system for the last many decades has been shifted, been changed over the years, but we've never had a complete removal of the whole system potentially to replace it with something else. So this is a real moment in time. So I just want to touch on some of the good, the bad and the ugly points of that. And then I'll talk specifically about sustainability issues. We have a huge opportunity to reshape our contract with farmers. Got the bills coming up that will help us do that. The bad is the range of challenges that make this hard to get right. And the ugly is the potentially harmful trade deals, the politics, the lack of time we have to get this right. So just quickly on the good. That is a picture of the original Agricultural Act, which we no longer use because we became part of the common European agricultural policy. But what we have now is the opportunity to have a new Agricultural Act. There's many proposals out there, which I'll touch on, to have a new and better system, better delivers for what the public really needs, what farmers need. As Michael Gove, who's the Defra Secretary of State, said, and in this unfrozen moment, new possibilities occur. In his recent speech at WWF, he made a very passionate speech about this, which I'll refer to again. It also provides us with an opportunity to have a transition, avoid cliff edges for farmers and consumers where they find produce off the shelves or changes in the way farming is regulated and supported. That transition is very important, and we do have a bit of time to have that. How much time is a moot point. But during that time, we should be testing, trying out schemes, learning from the errors that we've had in the past. We've had many, many years. When I started out in the mid-90s working on agri-environment policy, I started working on the Article 19 of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was very much a voluntary article which countries could implement across Europe to support farmers doing things in greener ways. It became regulation 2078. But that's from the 90s, 92 in fact. And so we've had all those years since 92 of trying things out, trying out schemes, agri-environment schemes and others. So we know a lot of what works and a lot of what doesn't work, how to do it, the complexities in terms of not only design of the schemes, but monitoring and enforcement. So we've got a huge expertise, a huge body of research that we can draw on, and we should use that. We're really, really good at this in some ways and really bad in others. Just a quick aside, I have written this presentation with the view that people have a certain amount of knowledge about the issues, but I apologise if I use jargon that people don't understand, and we can go over some of those in the chat afterwards, but apologies. I have been working for so long, I forget sometimes what people may or may not be aware of. So going on to the bad, what may get in the way of getting the right outcome for farm support after Brexit? Capacity in Defra, although they are have recruited a huge number of new staff, those staff won't necessarily have the knowledge and experience. You also have government policies which may get in the way, government priorities to do other things, and again I'll touch on that, what they work on, what they make an effort with investigating, and what they do in terms of negotiations with Europe and with other countries and trade deals, but with the European deal will depend on many other priorities, so that could get in the way. The legacy of the old policy could get in the way. I talked about a lot of experience and understanding. That it may also mean that farmers are very wary of any new kind of support scheme, any new agri-environment scheme, particularly if it looks complicated and it involves a lot of paperwork, a lot of monitoring enforcement, a lot of farm visits and those kind of things. They can really cloud people's judgment, quite understandably. So we need to get this right and involve people right at the early stage in design. Vested interests and conflicting interests from industry in terms of whether they really want to deliver public interest through farm policy. That will be crucial, and again I'll touch on that. And whether we have the budget. Treasury is key here. Will we have the 3.3 billion that we currently spend annually on agricultural and rural and agri-environment policy? If not, how much? This is a big, big question and will dictate a lot. And finally, complexity. If it's complex, people won't want to do it. And there's a lot of calls for it, for removing red tape, but more generally to have something very simple. And that's been a common cry throughout the Common Agricultural Policy's life. It's too complicated. Obviously, when it's funding farmers a lot of money, and they know they benefit from it, they're not going to complain too much, but they still complain. And it's difficult for them. But if it's too complex and they're having to do a lot of work to get the money, it may not work. Anyway, so that's some of the bads. But the uglies, you could get really big problems with vested interest from the food industry to have the cheapest possible raw food materials to put into the processed food that they sell. And from 30 years of working on food and farming, the push from the food industry to have as cheaper raw materials as possible is definitely there. Whatever we hear on the surface about wanting high standards and wanting to buy British, wanting to keep farmers and consumers safe and happy. There is a real push there, and that will not go away. And the corporate interest in trade deals is extremely high. And alongside that, the anti-red tape ideology, we've already heard that from members of parliament. Cut the red tape, cut the rules and things which constrain farmers doing what they want. There's a little bit of fairness in that, but a huge amount of it is ideological rubbish that I would say is seriously flawed. And then trade deals. I'll get touching on these a bit later in more detail, but other goals for the government in terms of what trade deals they do, whether they want to reduce tariffs on manufacturing or have a better deal for finance so that we can export our extremely strong finance sector into other countries, particularly America, could mean that we lose out on our strong farm standards and farm support, which will be a disaster. So it's just on the good and the bad and the ugly. Now I wanted to go on to sustainability. And I've did this list, and I did it as an animated list. I realize looking at it now as a slide, it's rather huge, but we can't have animation in this presentation. And I'm sure a lot of you out there will be saying, oh, you've missed out this, you missed out this. But these are just some of the things that have come up during my work in terms of what makes UK farming sustainable. And I put at the top ongoing viable business, jobs up and downstream, because that is a key element. The socioeconomic part of the equation of sustainability is crucial. And we saw in The Guardian a couple of days ago big exposés around pollution from farming, dairy farming in particular, but all farming, of our rivers and streams. And a lot of farmers saying it is really, really difficult to put in place the measures to stop that pollution when we don't get a fair deal in the marketplace. We don't get the dairy prices we need in order to invest in the proper care of the manure holding tanks, etc. So that is really crucial, and jobs and workers being treated properly, obviously crucial. But we're going on to the other more traditional sustainability elements, biodiversity and nature. 70% of the land in the UK is farmed. That's absolutely crucial that it's farmed with care for biodiversity and nature, because these provide us with vital well-being that we need, but also the natural capital, the soil, the trees, the pollinators, the water, the land that actually sustain us. And pollution, reducing pollution, climate change emissions, water use. These are all, obviously, I don't need to go into detail, these are all heavily affected by farming. I've also talked monoculture there, which has a big impact on landscape and a big impact on many of these other factors in terms of biodiversity, in terms of farming, the farm system itself, whether it's actually fundamentally sustainable, often relates to the kind of setup in the actual farm, which we'll go into in a bit. But I've also talked about public health and global impacts, which are crucial elements of sustainability. And I was just chatting before this presentation about the fact I could have just had 2 slides and said one of the ways in which we could make the whole farm system more sustainable overnight would be to have a massive impact on the way we produce meat. And that has a big impact on dietary disease and zoonoses, which are the transmitted diseases through animal livestock, way, bird flu, BSE, etc. And also the role of nature in our well-being has a big impact on public health. So just the package of public health things are very crucial. We could talk about in the chat afterwards about what I've missed here. I'd be very interested to hear you if you want to chat about that. So going on to the next slide. These are some of the areas where those indicators of sustainability have been harmed over the years by not only the common agricultural policy, but by the lack of proper regulation of farming. Biodiversity in nature, number of farming birds in the UK has declined by 54% since 1970, and we've lost 97% of our flower-rich grassland meadows that provide us with so much biodiversity since the 1930s. This is well documented, the State of Nature report, which is produced every year, well documented, and a lot to do with farming. Don't need to go into that in a huge amount of detail. Pollution, massive increase in agricultural pollution since we started having very industrial intensive, particularly livestock systems, but there is also pollution from fertilizer runoff, soil erosion, and pesticide impacts. That's the recent example there is the recent expose in The Guardian, 300 cases of agricultural pollution since 2010. Really quite significant. And natural capital, pollinator, I've just given an example there of the pollinator species, which provides with €20 billion a year in services, our little workers. But they're in decline. Pollinators are definitely in decline due to changes in habitats, changes in cropping systems, and use of pesticides, some in particular. Another aspect of workers. In the UK, we have, in England in particular, we have 120 salaried workers in the farm system. They don't have a wages board now. That does exist in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And that means that they don't have kind of the oversight of an independent arbitration panel to ensure that they're treated properly, because they're quite a difficult sector, workers in agriculture, a difficult sector to look after, being not contained in a factory or in other particular accessible workers organised by unions. So they do need particular attention, their particular treatment that can be very harmful and cause misery for workers. That's a key part. And I'm not saying that farmers don't treat their workers well, but there are cases where they don't, and they need to have particular care. So a wages board would provide them with that. Antibiotics, on-farm antibiotics use, which are very medically important, and obviously resistance build-up of antibiotics for medical use is a potential time bomb for medicine, and we won't be able to do basic surgery or basic treatments if we don't tackle this now. And yet nearly half of our antibiotic use is used in livestock in farming to ensure that the industrial livestock system can actually continue. Without it, you wouldn't be able to keep animals in the very tight conditions that they're held, mostly indoors. And then public health I touched on earlier, a lot of death, premature deaths as a result of diet-related disease, and it's estimated to cost $6 billion a year to the NHS. And then finally, only one of the global impacts, 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. There are many others impacts that I could talk about, but I've probably taken up too much time on that slide. It was just a snapshot, some of the elements that we have to deal with when we're talking about sustainability in the food system, why we could do something really new and different to tackle that. And somebody who's been very passionate about that recently is Michael Gove, more passionate than I am. Farmland and bird numbers have been cut in half, species have been devastated, bees and other pollinators threatened. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the energy which powers enterprise are all threatened if we do not practice proper stewardship of the planet. He hadn't really said much about that before in his political life, but it was great to hear him speak so passionately at his recent speech at WWF, and it's worth a read. Obviously, the proof is in the pudding about what he does, and a lot of what he's announced so far was already in the pipeline, so we really need to see some strong policies in action. So this slide is a horrible slide with far too much writing, but the four elements of what determines farm sustainability, I did it here because I know people can read these slides afterwards, so you can have a look at what I've put. And again, there's probably a number of gaps, but it just shows that all these elements will determine how sustainable a farm is. It looks a bit fuzzy as well, I'm not quite sure why, but those elements of farm income I will be talking about in more detail because that's related to the support scheme from government. But what is equally important is how they're treated, how much knowledge and skills they have from their family and from their neighbours, from the agrochemical companies that advise them, and what they learn to the family. The community, whether they can cooperate with the community, share machinery, whether they can share knowledge, share costs, and share understanding and research. And then the financial community that supports them, that's absolutely crucial. The farm assets they have on farm, the staff, the equipment, the farm type, obviously massive impact. But then looking at the farm income, that's what we're going to talk to a bit more, because that obviously determines what they can do in terms of changing their practice to be more sustainable on farm. And that's looking at the cost of production, the inputs, labour, how much it costs to produce the food, market prices, market forces, fair dealing. That's absolutely crucial. and whether the grocery and the food service sector actually pay and give farmers a fair deal will determine whether they can farm sustainably. And the subsidy scheme, which I'll go on to in more detail. And then off-farm sources are more and more crucial to farmers to have off-farm sources, income sources. Yeah, I'll move on. So I was interested to know if how much income people on this webinar think comes from the market and how much from the taxpayer. I don't know if anybody wants to type anything now, suggesting what they think the percentage might be. Is it 50%, 20%? Because it's often seen as quite in the media that farmers get a huge amount of income from subsidies, or they don't get any. People don't understand how it works, and it is complex. But 60% from the market, somebody has suggested. David said 30% from the market. All very interesting answers. Shows the range of people understanding, and it does vary, and it also is complex. And a few other people are typing some answers. It might be worth having a look what they're saying before I go on to 20% and 10%. People, big range there, 30 to 40. The reality is, I'll go on to the actual answer in a bit. But the Common Agricultural Policy, just to quickly cover that, as people are still typing, there have been many changes, as I've mentioned, since its inception in the when we joined in the 70s, and most recently since the 90s. And I don't have time to go into the detail how the Common Agricultural Policy has changed. So what I've got here is how it currently works with two pillars: the direct payments, which are per hectare and basically provide farmers with a support scheme per hectare, but they have very weak conditionality. So farmers aren't. There's a certain amount of greening and complex things, and across Europe there are very different types of schemes, and even within the UK the schemes vary. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland apply this differently from England, but that's the first pillar, and it's basically to support farmers in being farmers, and that's changed massively over the years, but it takes up the bulk of the payment. And the second pillar is agro-environment. I've just noticed Dr. Nancy Oakes has said depend on farm size, type and location, which is absolutely right. But agro-environment is the second pillar, taking up only about 500 million per annum of the 3.3 billion. And it delivers the kind of schemes which you might be aware of already, countryside stewardship and organic schemes and other schemes which support farmers in changing their practices so that they are more environmentally sustainable, and rural development schemes as well, to support rural economies and business development. But the schemes there, the money there is for income foregone and costs incurred in doing those things. So it's very different from the first pillar, which is basically payment devised through a process that I can't possibly go into now. But the agro-environment is in theory for costs foregone for the farmer, how much it costs him to use staff to maintain a hedgerow, etc., etc. And as I said, the devolved responsibility for design under a common EU framework across Europe, that England, Wales, and Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland all have different schemes. But the pillar one is pretty similar across. But going on to the answer to the question, the average in England, the English farmer made 28,000 in subsidies and 2,000 from agriculture. So you can, as you can see, it's just above 10%. And the average cereal farmer lost 9,000. And these figures are actually similar. I just looked at them yesterday for Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. So they're making a huge amount from the subsidies, but it does, as Dr. Nancy Oakes online says, vary, and it's not as sort of simple as that. But that is the stark reality that farmers, English farmers and UK farmers, are relying very heavily on the subsidy scheme, which is designed in Europe, and for which we pay 3.3 billion into the pot, but that supports it across Europe. Adam's asking a question which we can talk about later, which you're absolutely right to ask. So looking in a bit more detail of farm business income, which is the interesting thing about looking, about where the income comes from, which defines whether a farm is sustainable. You can see the top light blue is the basic payment scheme, which is the Pillar 1 payment scheme. And you can see across the board for cereals, general cropping, mixed and horticulture, they all, apart from horticulture, rely heavily. So there's often an assumption that it's hill farmers that are, really relying on subsidies, or it's the really remote or inefficient farmers across the board. And I went to a meeting of the big farm organisations recently, and that's absolutely clear. That's not to say there aren't farmers that which don't rely on subsidies. There's obviously a huge range within that, but it's worth remembering that farmers do across the board rely on this support scheme. And as you can see, they get support from the agri-environment measures as well to a much smaller extent, and they to all rely on diversified income as well. So that's from the Defra accounts. So you can have a look at that in more detail. They obviously do very detailed studies on an annual basis. So where do we start thinking about where farmers get their income from, and where, given that a lot of it is from the support scheme, which is basically Pillar 1 payments? Oh, something's gone wrong here. I've missed the slide. I've lost the slide somewhere along the line. Oh, I've lost the slide. Go on. Oh no. Oh no, it's okay. Sorry about that. Sorry. Looking at that, thinking about that diagram that I had earlier on what makes a farm sustainable, it's clear that there's no single solution and it's going to be complicated. And we need to address all 4 elements in some way with a proper vision for farming for the future. And there are many ideas out there from the National Farmers Union, Countryside Land Association. Greener UK is a coalition of 13 of the major green and conservation NGOs some of you may be aware of. It's worth looking at their website. And they're about to launch a major report on this, which is definitely worth a look. I've seen drafts, it's very, very good. And it gives a lot of background, obviously focused very much on environment and conservation, but it's a very, very useful report. But all these organisations have released reports and are doing a lot of work on this area. So we need to address the design of the new scheme, how it's going to be costed, whether Treasury are actually going to give them money, the governance of it, how it keeps being designed, and who decides how it goes forward. How local that is in terms of design, whether there's any sort of local input into what kind of schemes get what kind of money, enforcement and monitoring of the scheme, integration with regulation, other regulations such as environmental regulations, and with other policies such as grocery regulation and other policies such as trade. So all those kind of things have got to be thought about, and so it's going to be complex. The old scheme, which was finally based on the basic payment scheme, which I've talked about, and additional grants based on income foregone, some people are saying that will be the basis for the future scheme. And in fact, the NFU want a sort of scheme which is direct payments and then sort of agri-environment and other add-ons. So a lot of people are talking like that, but there's an awful lot of people saying that we need a whole new scheme based on public goods. But it is going to be complicated. And I was just looking recently for a paper I did for Biodiversity Journal, looking at one element, biodiversity itself, on-farm biodiversity as opposed to global biodiversity, or biodiversity that goes beyond the farm gate. What kind of systems do you push for? Do you design a system to develop whole farm systemic approaches that mean the whole biodiversity on farm is addressed, such as organic farming or agroforestry? Or do you look at integrated crop farm management, just looking at certain aspects of the farm management scheme, or sustainable intensification of certain elements in order to free up other parts of the farm for biodiversity? So intensify one area and allow woodland or other areas to become more biodiverse. Or do you concentrate solely on site-specific restoration of nature, high-value nature sites or biodiverse species that you're focusing on, some of the action plan species, the birds that we've decided to really focus on. So that's just one element of sustainability, biodiversity, on-farm biodiversity. And I was looking at that and I did a paper, and it just, the complexity is a little bit staggering. Other organizations are looking at it from a holistic approach, just a couple here. I looked at integrated farm management from LEAF, which has been around for a long time and helps farms to improve their sustainability on farm with a whole plan. And organic farming, which is around for more than 50 years. And so they've learned a lot about how not to do it and how to do it. They have a very detailed farm inspection scheme and set of standards which cover the whole farm. And so that's another aspect and then the approach, academics might be having more of a specific approach, looking at, I looked at the sustainability intensification platform, I think it's network. Anyway, I've got the website there, and they were looking at what are the effects of different cultivation practices on different outcomes. So that's very sort of academic way of it. Farmers may be thinking in that way, maybe they're not. Some are, some aren't. But that's another way of looking at it, from what kind of impacts you'd have from different cultivation, different planting, and different farm practices and livestock practices. And then this is a different way of thinking about it, looking at farmer behaviour. What farmer attitudes will determine whether they change their behaviour to deliver real benefits, perceived benefits, and the outcomes that you want to achieve from the new support scheme. That's very interesting. Again, that's the Centre for Rural Policy, which is a very interesting organisation looking at these issues. Michael Winter has been doing this for a very long time. So it's complex. These are just pictures I picked out to show the complexity of the farm system and how the supply chain will impact. So that's why all the retailers are there. Obviously, the supply chain is more than retailers. It's the food service sector and many others. But you know, all these things will have an impact. And on the bottom right there, that's a fair trade cashew nut production system, and the impact on the global food supply, because we currently import 40% of the food we eat, will be crucial as to how sustainable our food system is and our farm policy is, because it goes way beyond just what we produce here, obviously. So looking at the policy agenda, I've been looking at it since Brexit, seeing a lot of people talking about farm policy in the media who haven't been talking about it before. No, all about, I don't know if you've ever seen anything about chlorine chicken. Chickens are allowed to be washed in chlorine in America in order to remove bacterial contamination, other contamination. And that's one of the things that's got the headlines in terms of if we put down the barriers for standards in the UK and allow those kind of chickens into the UK, our chicken farmers won't be able to compete. That's just one example. And because the chickens are produced very, very cheaply in America, and the worker standards are very different from ours. And so there's a lot out there, a lot of media interest, a lot of people are talking about farming and food that weren't before. Sustain and other NGOs are doing networking, looking at the evidence base. We're doing a lot of lobbying and engagement, public planning, public influence. So just to be aware of that, you can get involved in those kind of organizations and looking at the impact of other policies and trade negotiations. But it's the most difficult time at the moment because we've got so many meetings, so many things that we should be doing. It's a tricky time, but it's also exciting. The critique of the old CAP is well established. There's been many, many reports, which I'm very happy to provide if people want afterwards, that the old CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, which I've already talked about, is not fit for purpose. The two pillars, direct payments. I'm just rehashing this because I'm going to go on to what we as Sustain think needs to happen in order to deliver a more sustainable farm system. So those two pillars, the direct payments, agri-environment, have been heavily criticised for not delivering for the taxpayer, which pays for them, and providing a huge amount of money for very large landowners without a huge amount of benefit. And the agri-environment and rural development strands being too little, too weak, ineffectively administered, and not adequately supported by training and promotion. So what we think needs to happen, we need to move from two pillars to four legs, which means we'd be putting aside the two-pillar approach and having a new land management contract. And I'll go on to have the details of that in a minute. We'd also have a new grant scheme that supports enterprising, sustainable businesses in doing what they need to do in order to supply new markets and existing markets. and then free or affordable advice, and supporting farmers to give advice. Anyway, I'll go on to these in a bit more detail. And the absolutely crucial wider policy framework. And what we argue is that it shouldn't be a top-down UK policy. It should continue to be devolved in terms of the policy under a UK framework to ensure that we do actually get the public goods that we want when we leave the EU. So what we want the new scheme to have is a set of principles underpinning it. And this is a very full slide, so I won't read it. You can read it afterwards. But we do believe there must be a clear commitment to a very sustainable, healthy, humane food, farming and fisheries policy after we leave the EU, establishing agroecology as the underlying principle of farming, one which actually sustains the soil, water and air and biodiversity and the workers fairly. And we think one of the principles is to give ongoing support for farming, and that may be 3 billion is needed. That needs to be calculated. And another principle, absolutely crucial, and which seems to have pretty universal support, including from Michael Gove, but all the NGOs, most people are saying we need it to be based on a public good or public benefit principle. So we should be getting something from this which you can't pay for through the market. And that means paying for kind of these kind of things in this point. Agroforestry, soil, water, avoiding flooding, high nature value farming systems, heritage features, archaeological features, high animal welfare, all these kind of things which won't be delivered through the marketplace, although some could and some should, where it won't, it will be supported by the market. That should be the focus. But we have quite a wide definition of that, and includes making sure that we have the kind of food delivered into the market that we need, and that workers are protected, and that we have small farms. But we need it to be targeted to where it was really needed. But we also need it to ensure that we end up with farm diversity that we need, the mosaic of UK farming sizes and types, which is so vital for protecting landscapes and rural economies. We have a huge range of small farms, medium-sized farms and large farm businesses. And there has been a massive drop in farm numbers as farms amalgamate because they can't cope with the kind of prices they're getting in the marketplace, and the subsidy scheme doesn't actually stop that being a problem. So farms have amalgamated, and we've lost many thousands of farms just in the last 5 years. And that will continue and get worse if we don't take care with the way in which we support farming. And I'll go on to that in a bit detail about how we can do that. But we think we need small farms, you need medium-sized farms for all sorts of reasons, and also to allow new entrants into farming. And also, absolutely is no question that we need to maintain standards and regulations and enhance them, in fact, that we have got from Europe, and the principles on which those are based, the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, which underpin European legislation through treaties rather than through regulation. That there is a real risk under the European withdrawal bill that we will lose those principles and the things that they deliver for us in terms of underpinning policy, so that it really protects our health and the environment. Those are absolutely crucial. And the final two principles, solidarity with Global South, no policies should harm the ability of farmers and consumers in the Global South to feed themselves sustainably. And that is a really important element. And trade deals, I will talk about that in more detail later. I'll probably need to speed up. But Michael Gove has said, I like to refer to our new Secretary of State, as he's been so vocal. He said there's a growing appetite for a new system. So we've got one for him, which respects the work of farmers and puts environmental protection enhancement first. Understanding how to create and protect habitats should be as much a part of good farming as understanding the latest crop and soil science. And I would add to that, understanding business planning is absolutely crucial for all of this. It's complicated. We do need to have a culture shift. Farmers, NGOs need to think differently and talk differently about the way in which farming delivers for us, not just food, although food is absolutely crucial. But farmers need to accept that there is a public good that they're delivering on. They're going to get supported in that. Natural capital being part of that. Natural capital being the way in which the land protects and supplies us with the goods we need, such as water, soil, flood alleviation, trees that take pollution from the air, etc., etc. Natural capital is a relatively new concept, not that new, but there's awful lot of work run by the Natural Capital Committee, which will be underpinning a lot of the new way in which farming is supported. So I wrote a blog on just why taxpayers need a housemaid agreement with farmers, because I think we need to accept that it's going to be complicated and we shouldn't resist that. We should embrace the complexity, but get it right. And that's really hard. So our scheme, going back to the four elements of our scheme, the four legs, the land management contract, I haven't got time to go into a huge amount of detail, but it would be a menu or points-based support scheme based on outcomes, but those outcomes need to be thought through. And it needs to be multi-annual, so farmers and land conservationists can plan. And it needs to be based on public good outcomes, such as flood alleviation, animal welfare, conservation, nature, soil. But there needs to be specific boosts for these four areas that we've identified as needing particular care: agroforestry, pasture-based livestock systems, which deliver an awful lot for animal welfare, but also for consumers and for landscape. Horticulture, we import about 85% of the fruit that we eat, and I think it's 50% of the fruit of the vegetables. That needs to change. We need to be increasing our production of sustainably produced fruit and veg in order to provide healthy fruit and veg for consumers and affordable fruit and veg. That's very clear from surveys done of the horticultural industry. At the moment, it's unsupported largely through the Common Agricultural Policy, and it could get the right kind of support to make it grow, allow it to be environmentally sustainable, and supplying new markets, local markets, regional markets, and finding new entrants. We know we need new, young, enterprising, clever entrants into farming that get the balance between environmental sustainability and farm business planning and know how to marry the two. So we also believe that there needs to be a specific system for organic. It's got known outcomes. It's a well-established system of farming, and that should be maintained and enhanced as a specific strand. And I propose that we need a whole farm payment systemic system, because I think a system-based approach is the right way, but we don't, apart from organic, we don't really have one. So I think there could be development of that one, and that was supported by the Alliance. One of the key and controversial elements that we're supporting is the idea potentially of tapering or capping the payments, because the larger the farm, the more they'll get potentially if it's based on area, acreage. And that means that the very large farms will potentially get all the money for doing a certain amount of these public goods, and that's fine. That makes sense. I'm told over and over again, if you're paying for goods, you pay for the goods. It doesn't matter how big the farm is. A lapwing on a large farm is the same as a lapwing on a small farm, or a skylark. So that is true, but the reality is that large farms have a huge benefit of scale. They have more staff, more resources, more capital, and more probably finance to support the kind of schemes that we're talking about. It's not across the board, but I think there's a strong case to make sure that money is not all swallowed up by the largest farms. So suggestion of a certain amount of capping or tapering. I've said based on hectareage or based on FTEs, sorry for using acronyms, full-time equivalent of employees, number of people employed or making a livelihood. So that's the unemployed owner and partner. So you could have a cap, and that's a controversial, there's strong opposition to that. But to make sure that we're actually targeting the money to where it's needed, we can talk about the data. I've got a certain amount of time left. Right, I need to rush. So the second element of the way in which we're proposing sustaining is through supporting businesses through capital grants, maintenance, and maintenance schemes, funds for facilitating farmers to cooperate and set up ways in which they can work together and learn together better. There's a huge amount of understanding and learning on this that we believe should be supported. Backing sustainable enterprises in farming, and that is key. Free advice and supporting farmer-to-farmer advisory networks. That is clearly an area where we've lost a lot by losing the free advisory scheme many years ago, ACAS. ADAS, sorry, which is now a private company providing advice, but we believe there should be new free advice to help farmers in the new era of public goods delivery. And then the wider policies. I don't have time to go into all these. They're given in some detail in the briefing and in our other work, but these are absolutely crucial to ensure that we have a sustainable farm system. If we just have the support scheme, it won't work. We need to have proper standards and regulation on labelling, supply chain regulation. Grocery Code Adjudicator regulates the grocery system, but we need it to be expanded. We need protecting workers. We need a really strong emphasis on research and development to boost our understanding of how we can deliver the land management scheme and agroecological schemes across farming. And farmer-led innovation, absolutely crucial. There's a really good innovation scheme that the Soil Association run with others, which is providing a huge amount of understanding and new ideas, really creative and practical. Better trade, I probably have to leave that, but trade deals will have a huge impact on farmers' ability to buy their inputs, sell their goods here and globally, and how the tariffs are determined both into Europe and globally. That's a one for another webinar probably. I ran an expert workshop on this, which identified all sorts of issues that we need to be touching on. But the payments need and could be compatible under the World Trade Organization Agreement on Agriculture. We think what we've designed would be compatible under that, but we need many other aspects of the trade deals to be improved. Sustainable diets, the policy should be checked for making sure that it's actually helping us deliver sustainable diets for all. I touched on that. Eating less and better meat, eating more fruit and veg, eating more wholemeal, more fresh produce available, it would be a goal that we would advocate. And that goes with the food procurement, making sure that food going to schools, hospitals, and care homes and into the armed forces actually are produced to the highest standards and are supported. Timeline, I'm not going to go into that, so you can look at that later. This is possible for the 4 bills that are very relevant to this: EU withdrawal bill, trade bill, agriculture bill. And what we want, the goals from our work would be that all farmers have a business and environment plan, preferably in the same thing, which encompasses support for protecting nature and natural capital, but also make sure that farmers can actually have a viable businesses for the future. This is coming up time and time again in my work. Farmers have always struggled to have business planning, and that needs to be a key part of how we go forward. And therefore, we're incentivizing good behaviour and penalising bad behaviour where needed through withdrawal of the funds and through the regulatory system. So we're having oversight of pollution, etc., through the Environment Agency and Natural England. We need the new training and advice and R&D programs so they support farmer-led innovation and development and sustainable farming schemes. And what we'll end up is with high levels of healthy food consumption of UK produce, ideally reduce greenhouse gases from agriculture and food consumption. That ultimately is a crucial part of the whole picture, and I haven't touched on it very much because I didn't want to dominate the whole thing with a climate focus, but that is absolutely essential. We will see a reverse in the decline of farmland species, pollinators, soil loss, flooding, and so on. All these would, as a result of a new scheme, be the result of a new scheme, and maintain levels of farms that we actually have, and increase levels of new entrants, and have well-managed retirement. Those are the kind of goals that we see from what we want, and involving farmers in that will be key. So all types of farmers, not just the organisations such as the NFU and the CLA. We need to have a proper consultation with farmers and citizens, experts, academics, NGOs, land managers, citizens reps. I've sort of put that in there as a throwaway thing, but we really need to understand better what the public wants to see from its support for farming, and obviously food businesses and dietary experts. And we should have pilots to test any new system with ongoing monitoring and evaluation, including socioeconomic evaluation of impacts. We used to do a lot of socioeconomic impact evaluation of the agri-environment scheme. they've gone, as far as I can tell, I have been looking, and I might be wrong, and there's probably a lot of academic that have done work in this area, but it seems we really need to know what the socioeconomic impact on jobs, on incomes are, so we can actually start to really link those two things together, the natural capital, environmental and other benefits, with the business planning and business viability. We need stakeholder and public discussions around this. The Defra were planning some before the election was announced. They've all seemed to have gone away, but we hope they'll be coming back, and we hope they'll be run well and with strong public involvement. And we need a transparent and accountable process for taking these views into account, so we know why they're not doing things that people have suggested, and that the parliamentarians are really heavily involved and understand what is involved. I know there's a new MPs, but current MP before the election, not all of them were very clear on what the agricultural policy looks like and how it works. There's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of throwaway comments about red tape, which were really unhelpful. So we need full parliamentary insight. And I've lost some of my slide there. But, so to answer the original question of the seminar, how sustainable can it be? Significantly more sustainable than it is now, but it depends on the political will and desire to act. More than speak and consult and write reports, we need action. We need some really, really good listening and really good new policies based on really good testing and pilots and experts. We need informed public engagement, as I just mentioned, and willingness to test, to make mistakes, trust farmers and listen to farmers, and we need to break with tradition and not fear making mistakes, as I said, but not to assume that how we've done it in the past is the best way to do it. But equally, how we've done it in the past can be. And we need a strong evidence base, including farmer evidence. And ultimately, we need the right budget. If we can't support farmers in doing what we want them to do and to looking after the animals and the land in the way that we want, we will end up with disaster after disaster. And if farmers are open to a global marketplace where they're competing with hormone beef in the US and foreign washed chicken and very cheap labor standards from Asia, it will be extremely quick that we'll see some disasters and food crises, and our farmers will go out of business, and we'll end up with a very, very large amount of exodus from the rural farm community. So I hope I've just done a very big sweepstake through the issues. I've got a slide on what people can do. Get involved if they're interested. Join the mailing list, get updates. We've got a lot of mailing lists at Sustain. We have a main Brexit forum, but I also run an agricultural policy one, and I do a lot of blogging. We've got an e-action to MPs. You can engage with your MPs and peers in the House of Lords, who will be very important in terms of oversight of new statutory instruments in the new bills. And buying produce from certified known high standard sources such as pasture-fed livestock association, soil association, and farmers, leaf farmers, etc. Get engaged with the farming community and with Sustain members. We have a large membership that are very, very active on many of these areas. We'll be featuring their expert opinions on Brexit impacts and what needs to happen in blogs over the coming months. And follow us on Twitter. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. And there's my email if you want to get in touch. That's the new farm policy briefing, which is available on our website, or I can send it to you by email if you find the website difficult to navigate. And I do tweet a lot if you want to follow me on Twitter.
Thank you, Vicki. That was a very insightful and very thought-provoking webinar. You covered an awful lot, so there's quite broad questions that have come in. But just on the back of what you said about what people can do, if you're kind of assuming that the average consumer doesn't know a huge amount about the farming industry and things, and they do shop in the larger supermarkets, are there kind of key things that people can look for, or key labelling, key kind of areas to use as a guideline, really, to make a small difference?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. One we get a lot at Sustain. We do a lot of work on the food and consumer side of the equation as opposed to farming. And looking out for labels like organic label, official, legally accredited labels, and labels which have used third-party accreditation is key. And we have a list of those on our website, such as Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, Leaf, Soil Association, Organic Farmers Growth. There are many, and the Red Tractor is one which certifies to basic UK standards. That's the Red Tractor logo. And I would argue people can ask questions. The more they go to local suppliers, ask questions of their butcher and their local shops, but also get involved with the organisations that work with farmers and work on these issues. So become an active citizen consumer as opposed to just a consumer.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And like you say, asking questions is the key thing. I think as soon as people start to kind of build that rapport with your local supermarket even, or your butchers and individual suppliers, you kind of, that knowledge automatically grows. So a couple of other questions that we've got, again, like I say, they're quite varied, but I've got one from Stephen Jacobs who says, how can stewardship be delivered better? Natural England are struggling to deliver the organic stewardship scheme as it is, and tech is being blamed, etc. There will be issues beyond simply the gadgetry, and that lead more toward a lack of training and guidance among staff and service users.
I think the answer to that is that we need to really learn from our mistakes. There have been huge mistakes which Stephen identifies in the current schemes, and it is sad that we've had consistently bad IT and setups and tech, but training and guidance on staff and service users is actually key. I mean, you could argue that we should be investing a huge amount in this. That goes back to whether the Treasury will deliver that to Defra. Defra, in its wisdom, and the Secretary of State several years ago gave up a lot of the budget from Defra in the big austerity drive in government departments, and that, I would say, was a huge mistake. Ideally, we would get some of that back to invest in staff trainings, sort of learning. There is a new era of digital trainings and webinars like this and ways of doing it which are more cost effective, but learning from each other and sort of using those that have been involved for a long time will be key. Stephen makes an absolutely crucial point, and it's a point that probably gets forgotten. I'm actually going to a meeting about indicators, on-farm indicators, in a couple of weeks. I'll be going to a farm to look at what farms can currently do, how to do it. We don't want it to be really complicated, but at the same time, we will have to understand what farmers are doing ideally on an annual basis to deliver on what they're getting funding for. And there's no way around that. And then logging that and tracking that will be part of the process, which is the responsibility of whatever body manages the new support scheme. The RPA at the moment continues to struggle, and across the different devolved. I think there has been a lot of problems, so hopefully we can learn from those.
Yeah, like you say, hopefully this will be kind of a work in progress, and lessons will be learned. Another question I've got is from Robert: is agriculture and environment are devolved policy areas in the UK? After Brexit, variation in approaches to land management and agriculture policy is likely. What problems do you anticipate this could cause, and how can they be mitigated?
Well, absolutely, it's possibly one of the biggest headaches we're going to have, or problems we're going to have over the design of the new scheme. I mean, whether we're going to have one Agricultural Act or four is still, I'm still hearing people talking about that. What Defra really needs to do is open their ears and listen to the devolved administrations. And I'm hearing that's not always happening. Some of the meetings I'm going to, I'm hearing it's just not happening. And therefore, that's absolutely crucial that Defra works with administrations, work with Defra to develop a common way of discussing this, and then discusses it and devises schemes which will work. What we've obviously benefited from being part of Europe is that there's a common framework. And so it was easy. You had the common framework, common rules, amounts of money that were allowed, etc. And then each of the devolved administrations applied that in their own way, such as Scotland having its specific scheme for suckler herds. I think that was a coupled payment, but very much reflected what they needed to support for farmers in particular areas. And we don't have any of those coupled payments in England. they should be able to continue doing that if that makes sense for them, and they should be able to say why it makes sense. I guess we need to be thinking very much outcome based and measuring the outcomes and understanding how that has happened in the past and applying that to the discussions in the future. But really, all I could say with that is that Defra really needs to open the channels of communication and work really hard and have the right number of staff and demand resources to have the right number of staff to make that happen. Because if we come to a grinding halt because Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are saying no way are we going to accept that agricultural bill draft that a white paper that you've just presented, that would be such a shame. And we have a real opportunity here, as I said at the beginning, to devise, to have our dream, we have an opportunity to have our dream sport system. And that dream is different in the different devolved administrations. And they should be allowed to respond to what their farming communities and their public want. So, we've really got to be listening and making sure we do get it right from now on. Ideally, we won't rush it. And the agricultural bill may well be just a holding bill to allow us to have those conversations. It's hard to tell at the moment until we see a white paper.
Yeah, and like you say, added to that is the time pressure of not having an awful lot.
No, but the fact that we've got the government has said that they're going to keep the current scheme in place, hopefully doing pilots and testing new schemes in the interim, but they're keeping the current scheme in place till 2022, means that we have a bit of time, but still these things will take time to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So just aware of the time, I've just got space for one last question. Talking about Defra, I think this is quite relevant. So this is from Adam. He says, I've heard that any attempt to remove the subsidy system is likely to flounder for the rather mundane reason that Defra's rural payments software is so inflexible that no other payment structure is kind of a possible option. How true is that?
I'm not an expert in that, but I think Stephen, who was given the previous question, might be, and others in the farming community are. I clearly, from what I've read over the past couple of years, there's been huge problems. And we've spent a huge amount of money on this, but we might just have to bite the bullet and spend a load more on having the right system. I hope that the government is looking overseas to other countries where the response to what scheme they have in place and how it's being administered in the IT is a positive one, and therefore we can learn from it. I don't have any understanding of that. I'm hearing a lot about other support schemes in New Zealand, in Switzerland, in Japan. There's a lot of people talking about that and blogging about it and writing about it, because obviously it's relevant to look at other countries, how they currently support their farming. I hope they're also looking at the IT schemes. That would be really interesting to see if the feedback from the farming community is that it works, and feedback from the end beneficiaries, such as the conservation bodies, are saying that it works as well. I know Switzerland has an incredibly intensive process and a very strong support for its farmers, but it's based on farmers doing a lot. So we need to look probably overseas to some of the gadgetry and IT that's being currently used elsewhere, and obviously learn from mistakes. I mean, I heard the other day somebody say it'd probably be Natural England that will be running the new support scheme, and I don't find that very hard to believe, but they are running some interesting pilots at the moment, which some of the listeners might be aware of, in various places, looking at how we can base payments on natural capital and outcomes that are very specific to place, based on what farmers and the local landowners want to achieve, such as particular biodiversity outcomes. And that would be interesting to learn from. Natural England are obviously learning a lot from that about what will work, but I think we need to make sure that the stakeholders are as wide as possible, not just large landowners and Natural England, but local communities and others who have a say, and obviously the wider governmental framework will be crucial there as to what we actually want to invest our taxpayers' money.
That's great, and it's such a shame that we've run out of time, because I think there's so much more that we'd like to explore. But your presentation was excellent, and you gave a really broad kind of snippet of what the farming industry is looking at. And yeah, I'm afraid I don't have time for any more questions, but I'd just like to thank you for your time and for really, really thought-provoking webinar. And hopefully, if you don't mind, people will contact you and ask any questions that they haven't been able to ask through the webinar. Keep an eye out for any future webinars which are coming up. We tend to do one a month, and there are some coming up, so they will be advertised on the website soon. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. I think it's very topical, and we'll see what comes our way. Thank you.